director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. The KHC is honored to co-convene today's two-part virtual symposium, Resurfacing Memories of the Holocaust in Bulgaria and the Former Yugoslavia, with the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, which is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. The Harriman Institute's mission is to serve the community at Columbia University and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together its extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. The Institute is committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy, and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. Our panel today is entitled Uncovering the Legacy of the Holocaust in Bulgaria and features three special guests, Ms. ELKA NIKOLOVA, Dr. Stephen Sage, and Dr. RUMYANA MARINOVA-CHRISTIDI, and will center around a discussion about Ms. Nikolova's documentary film, A Question of Survival, the complex legacy of the Holocaust in the Balkans, as well as the challenges of doing research in a country where the history of the Holocaust has been mythologized, obscured, and contested. This panel is particularly significant because today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a powerful reminder that both the catastrophe of and lessons from the Holocaust continue to reverberate both here and abroad. Our concerns these days center much less on outright Holocaust denial and instead on a more virulent and dangerous form of Holocaust distortion, where every detail about these past horrors, including the glorification of perpetrators who committed them, is marshaled, reinterpreted, and warped for nationalist, anti-Semitic, and racist aims. But today is also a deeply somber reminder that the Holocaust isn't just a global abomination where 6 million Jewish people were vanquished from the planet, in addition to millions more people tortured and murdered by the Nazis, including untold numbers of Roma and Sinti people because of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. Because when we speak in vast numbers, we can also forget that this horror befell regular people just like you and me. One final note before we begin, our session is 90 minutes and will include short presentations by each of our speakers, followed by a discussion which I will moderate. We encourage you to submit your questions and comments via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for those of you participating in Zoom. And both parts of today's symposium are also being recorded and will be available on the Harriman Institute's YouTube channel. Now, to kick things off, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. ELKA NIKOLOVA, who was born in Bulgaria and studied psychology at the University of Sofia before she moved to the US in 1994. In 2000, she received her MA in Media Studies from the New School in New York, my alma mater, and has worked in film and television since 2003. Her 2000 documentary film, Binka, to tell a story about silence, premiered at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Ms. Nikolova co-produced and edited the documentary film, Angel Waschenstein, Art is a Weapon, directed by Andrea Simon and completed in 2017. Her second documentary film, the one we'll be discussing today, A Question of Survival, focuses on the legacy of the Holocaust as seen through the eyes of 3 Bulgarian Jewish survivors in New York, which premiered during the 2021 Southeast European Film Festival in Los Angeles. And Ms. Nikolova is also currently working on her third documentary, The Dressmaker, which continues her exploration of the Holocaust in the region. Dr. Nikolova, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Should I just do my presentation now, or thank you so much. I'm very honored to be part of this panel today, and especially on this day of remembrance when we honor the victim of the Holocaust and remember the survivors. And for me, this is a very important topic. I have spent quite a lot of time working on it, and I have to admit that I started from zero knowledge, and it has been a great privilege and challenge for me to expand my knowledge on the subject. I will share my experience on working on this film and the reason that I decided to make the film. In 2009, I was doing research at the Museum of Modern Art on a different project when I was approached by Rosette Bakish, who introduced herself as somebody who was born in Bulgaria and had to leave the country at age 10 because her family was Jewish. And she recounted a number of very happy memories of her childhood in Bulgaria. She told me that her father had a leather factory in Sofia, and they had a house in the center of Sofia, and the family was very successful. At that moment, as I said, I had to admit that I had very little knowledge about the Jewish community in Bulgaria. I grew up in a small town in the north of Bulgaria on the border with Romania, and I haven't met any Jewish persons until I moved to Sofia, to the university. And in my history books, the Holocaust was a half a page, and let's say 8th or 9th grade. So I had almost zero knowledge of what had happened to the Bulgarian Jewish community. So when I arrived in New York, with its large Jewish community, it was my first real exposure to the Jewish culture, Jewish customs, and of course, the history of the Holocaust. And I made a lot of Jewish friends, and I can fondly recount many Passover celebrations I attended as a guest at their table. So I slowly began my research on the story of the Bulgarian Jews, and at the time when I started, the predominant version of the story was that Bulgaria have saved its Jews, and during World War II, and the pride Bulgarians felt about this event. And I was really excited to learn this, and I wanted to learn more about the story. But the moment I began more in-depth research, I realized and I learned that the story is a lot more complicated than it was presented at the time, and a lot more complex and has a lot of layers. So it began my education on the story of the Bulgarian Jewish community and how this story fit into the larger story of the Holocaust. And I read the books available at the time. I have to say that since then, so I'm talking about 2009, 2010, more books were published on the subject, and some of them predominantly, and correct me if I'm wrong, are in Bulgarian, and I hope that they will be translated so that the knowledge is accessible to people outside of the country. I also began interviewing survivors in New York, and by that time, this was the generation of the children and young adults who had been children or young adults in during the war in 1943 to 41 to 43. The parents had already passed on. So I realized that their memories of the events were not very clear, and at times confusing. It became apparent to me that they didn't have at times clear ideas of what exactly had happened to them. And they were looking back on these events with the eyes of children who were shielded to the best possible, to the extent that the parents could do that by the parents. But there was also the pain of recounting the events from their childhood when their families had to live in fear, and they had sensed that fear despite of the protection from the parents. They had difficulties to talk about these years. I sensed their confusion, especially after the families had immigrated from Bulgaria and left for Palestine, Israel, and later on arriving in New York. Once they realized now as young adults the extent of the Holocaust and what had happened to the Jewish population in Europe. So surrounded by Jews from Poland, Germany, Hungary, Austria, in New York, they had decided that their story was not so dramatic and important because their suffering was not so great. So that was the beginning, I think, of the question for themselves, like, are we really survivors of the Holocaust, true survivors of the Holocaust? So I said to tell the story of the Holocaust in Bulgaria from the perspective of these three eyewitnesses, Misha Abramov, Robert Bakish, and Chaim Zemak. And in its essence, this is not a historical film. It is a collage of memories and observations and reflections on these experiences. And the question of memory and how these memories are represented and passed on once the last survivors will leave us was very, very much on my mind. For the participation of Misha, Avramov, Robert Bakish, and Chaim Zemak, this was a difficult story to tell. I was a Bulgarian asking them questions about the painful part of their lives that happened back in our common country of origin, Bulgaria. The fact that I was Bulgarian must have provoked mixed feelings in them. They had a good life and good childhood in Bulgaria before the war started. And when the anti-Semitic law for the defense of the nation was implemented, Robert and Chaim, who were older, 14 and 16 at the time, had to wear the yellow Jewish star and at times endure the insensitivities of their classmates, even teachers. But both claimed that nothing much changed for them because they were allowed to continue going to school. They all came from successful middle-class families. Their fathers were educated abroad and had successful businesses. Soon after the law was implemented, their fathers had to close their businesses. Misha's father, who was the youngest, was sent to a labor camp along with all Jewish men ages 18 to 49 within Bulgaria to build roads and bridges and tunnels. My initial goal was to make a more of a historical documentary and follow the story in a more straightforward way. But I realized that Misha, Robert, and Chaim didn't have clear memories of the event, but were struggling with much more complex issue. Do they have the right to tell their story? Is their story even important considering the more dramatic stories of the Jews who had survived the labor and death camps? So once I realized that, the next step was to ask them the question and see what they think about it. I was surprised of the often different ways in which they saw themselves in relationship to this question. Chaim saw himself as a survivor because he was in danger, even though he didn't realize at the time that was the case. And in the last moment, that danger was avoided. Intellectually, Robert thought that he was a survivor, but he didn't feel that in reality, or so he claimed. While Misha didn't, who was the youngest, he was 5 years at the time of these events, Misha didn't believe to be a survivor, and he thought that this term survivor should be reserved for people who escaped death and were in real danger. So the debates between the three men reflect well the state of the debate about the Bulgarian story at the present. There are still so many areas that are debated, and many people think that survivors such as Misha, Robert, and Chaim should not be taken seriously because they don't remember the events clearly. And I disagree with that notion, because even though Chaim, Misha, and Robert avoided the death camps and their lives were spared, their family life was destroyed, their families were taken, property was taken, they were forced to immigrate out of fear of persecution. The tight-knit family structure where generations have lived together with their customs and culture, with their special language, Ladino, was eliminated or almost destroyed, and the families dispersed around many continents. So the effects on Misha, Robert, and Chaim were evident, but they could not say anything about it because on one hand, they were saved. So what should they complain about? And on the other hand, their suffering was not as big as that of the rest of the Jews of Europe. So is their story even that significant? So these were the questions that sort of, for me, emerged in their discussions and in my interviews with them. So for me, the Bulgarian story has two parts. On one, once Bulgaria entered the war in 1941 and became an ally in Germany in World War II, and soon it occupied territories in Thrace and Macedonia, where on these territories lived around 12,000 Sephardic Jews. So in March 1943, Bulgarian police rounded up and handed to Germany 11,343 Jews from these newly occupied territories. And they all almost all perish at Treblinka. This part of the story follows the very familiar fate of the rest of the European Jews who perished at the death camps. And I don't spend much time on this part of the story in my film because my subjects did not know much about it, and I did not want them to make up stories about something they didn't know. So, but they were very much aware of this part of the story and very conscious about it. This part of the story I will explore in my second documentary on the subject with the working title, The Dressmaker, which I'm in production of. The Dressmaker follows the fate of the Gateniu family from New York again, which has roots in Drama, Greece, and Sofia, Bulgaria. And the Greek part of the family was deported to Treblinka, while the Bulgarian part of the family survived in Bulgaria. So in fact, I will travel to Treblinka at the end of May with the daughter of the family to visit the site where the Greek part of the family perished, and that will become part of the film. So in this next project, I will be exploring more this part of the story. So the second part of the Bulgarian story, which is the focus of this film, is what happened to the Bulgarian Jews and why their fate was so different. The common version is that due to public outcry, the pressure put on the government by some members of parliament, the church, intellectuals, regular citizens, and members of the Jewish community, which advocated on its behalf, the deportation of the Bulgarian Jews was halted. So there are many different opinions on what exactly happened, depending on the political affiliation, the class or cultural differences. So for years, the Bulgarian archives were closed for researchers, and while the history and the story of the Holocaust was being written, debated, and researched, the story of the Bulgarian, Thracian, and Macedonian Jews was left out of this history. It was only in 1989, when the archives were finally opened, all historians, researchers, filmmakers, and artists began looking into this story and exploring it. But until today, the story remains little known, and many debates still exist as to why the Bulgarian Jews survive. And when I say the story is little known, I mean it's little known outside of Bulgaria, because in Bulgaria it is a well-known story and debated. So the contested memories of the few survivors from Thrace, Macedonia, and those from Bulgaria look at this story from a very different perspective. In my view, all these memories are valid as different. People experience these events in a different way. The survivors and the descendants of the Macedonian and Thracian Jews look upon these events from the perspective of people who have lost their family members in the hands of the Bulgarian police and government who delivered them to Germany. In Bulgaria, the Jews from the town of Plovdiv, for example, the second largest city in Bulgaria, and the town of Kyustendil and the surrounding small towns, look at these events from the perspective of people who were rounded up at the local schools ready for deportation. And it was only when in the last moment that deportation was stopped and they were told to go home. But also the Jews from Sofia look at these events from the perspective of them being sent to the provinces in order to break up the larger Sofia community and to prepare them for eventual deportation. So terminology is also very important here, and there is still a way to go before historians and scholars agree on what terminology to use when the Bulgarian story is described. I often found myself while talking to even historians or anybody else who knows anything on the subjects, using one word or another and being corrected or being stopped and says, no, you cannot use this term here. So I'm still not clear for myself, who has done all this research, and again, I'm not a historian, of what is the correct terminology when it comes to describing the Bulgarian story. So I hope the historians on the panel will talk about and clarify some of these questions for me as well. And I wanted to point out the importance of the public opinion, which manifested itself in the acts of some politicians, the church, intellectuals, and regular citizens, and again, the active role of the Jewish community, which advocated on itself. It was an important act, which needs to be studied and remembered, as an example of action taken at a moment when all hope was lost. That action had great consequences. The Bulgarian story could have been an all happy end story, but it's rarely in life. There is no such perfect story. It has, in the case of the public opinion, which existed in the beginning of this, but was not taken very seriously, it gradually became stronger, and it was able to manifest itself in the final act, which resulted in the survival of the Bulgarian Jewish community. My hope is that this documentary can provide a point of departure and a topic for discussion on the place of the Bulgarian story within the larger narrative of the Holocaust. I hope the debate on this topic creates more interest and scholarship on the subject, as the Bulgarian story provides us into many challenging and difficult questions humanity needs to address at present. Since the events in 1943 are very removed from us, and we might think it's difficult to imagine what had happened at that time, I think at present we are presented with almost like a deja vu with the many events that are happening around us. And it serves as a reminder of how difficult it is to remain engaged and alert during periods of war or pandemic in our case, when everybody is in survival mode. I hope that the moment comes when the Bulgarian story will be discussed with much more calm and reflection and more openness to the different points of view on the subject. And I thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, ELKA. You've brought up some really important points, and I'm excited because I'm going through the articles that both RUMYANA and Stephen wrote. You're really sort of bringing out a lot of the conversation that I hope we'll have after. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Sage. He's a specialist on Bulgaria at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, also known as USHMM. He's currently in volunteer status at the museum, but has remained active as a consultant and as an applied historical researcher. His summaries of the histories of camps and ghettos in Bulgaria were published in Volume 3 of USHMM's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, and besides additional contributions he's made to other periodicals such as Slavic Review and the Journal of Holocaust Research. He's also provided documentation for the Claims Conference and World Jewish Restitution Organization. Previously, Dr. Sage was the consular officer and second secretary at the U.S. Embassy in Sofia between 1984 and 1986, and his other Holocaust-related work was the 2006 book, Ibsen and Hitler, which documents the previously unknown but decisive influence of 3 dramas by the Norwegian playwright on the Nazi dictator. Dr. Sage, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'll try to get the PowerPoint screen up again. And is that right?
Not yet.
Okay. So, yes. Let's start by thanking ELKA for her talk and, of course, for her excellent film, which is a welcome addition to the record of the Holocaust in Bulgaria. Her documentary, as she stated, stands as a work of oral history and in particular focused on memory. That is to say, how events are recalled over 7 decades later. The people speaking in this film survived, and it is that very fact of survival which dominates their reminiscences. That is to say, they did survive the Holocaust. And there was a Holocaust in Bulgaria, notwithstanding all the talk of a rescue. There was a Holocaust, the Shoah, in Bulgaria. After all, Bulgaria had signed on to the Nazi, I'm trying to advance the slide here. It's not working.
You go to the right part of your screen, that scroll bar, you might be able to hit one of the bottom arrows, and
that's what I'm doing, but it's not working now. It worked before, but it's not working now. Let's oops. How do I do this now? Okay, well, is that visible?
Just the title slide is. Do you want to try unsharing and then sharing again?
Okay, unsharing. So how do I unshare now?
It should be at the top of your screen. There you go.
Okay, share screen. So I'll share it. Was share again, and click. Is it on? I don't see it on.
Not yet.
Should I hit share?
Yes, please.
Okay, now what do you see?
We see Hitler shaking another officer's hand.
That's King Boris. That's Boris, Tsar Boris III of Bulgaria.
I did not even close.
Okay, they were real good buddies. Hitler talks very complimentary about Boris in the Tischgespräche, the the Hitlerian table talk, by the way. So let me just see if I can advance the next slide. Yes. No. What? It's not advancing.
So you see the
Wait.
arrows in the bottom left?
I see the bottom. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll use those arrows. All right. Approximately 80% of the Jews in Bulgaria survived. That is to say, about 49,000 people survived. And by Bulgaria here, I mean the country in its 1940 frontiers, plus the adjacent areas of Yugoslavia and Greece that were occupied and administered as part of Bulgaria from spring 1941 to the autumn of 1944. As you can see, I'll use the cursor here. I hope you can see the cursor. This area to the southwest is what is now mostly the Republic of North Macedonia, and most of this was under Bulgarian administration during those months of spring 41 to autumn of 1944. This map is a little wrong in that it gives the Ohrid area to Bulgaria at that time. In fact, the Ohrid area was actually under Italian occupation, didn't go to Bulgaria. The other part that was annexed here, or not really formally annexed, but occupied and administered as part of Bulgaria, was the area of Trachea, Thrace, in northern Greece. And there are lots of towns in here which are not marked on this map. Germurgina or Komotini is marked. Okay, in that area, in that occupied area, lived about 12,000 Jews. And these are the people whom, as Elka already mentioned, these are the people who were deported to their deaths at Treblinka in March of 1943, numbering altogether some 11,343 individuals. They are the 20% of Bulgaria's Jews who perished. Now, it's really about the same percentage of survival and lethal victimization as occurred in Nazi-occupied France during the Second World War. But somehow the French didn't come up with a rescue story the way Bulgaria did, and this has greatly affected subsequent memory of the events. So, does this mean that what we call the Holocaust affected only parts of Bulgaria and occupied Greece during those years, while completely sparing metropolitan Bulgaria, the country in its 1940 frontiers and its current frontiers? No, of course not. The final solution of actual murder was only the last stage of the Nazi-designed process. Before the killing, that process in each Nazi-aligned or occupied country entailed the following steps. It entailed legislation to identify the Jews as an internal enemy. It entailed conducting propaganda campaigns to isolate them socially, to expel them from the professions, and to subject them to forced labor. This forced labor was no picnic. From 1941 to 44, Jewish men aged from 18 to the late 40s in age were compelled to work on road building projects, and they suffered beatings, overwork, malaria, malnourishment, insults, and the constant threat of deportation. One more slide of forced labor here, various vignettes of forced labor, working mainly on road construction throughout the country. Some of those roads are still used, they're motor roads of modern Bulgaria. What else did the Jews in Bulgaria proper suffer? They were marked with this identifying badge. A little different from some of the markings in other parts of Europe. It wasn't armbands in Bulgaria or a cloth badge, rather a bakelite plastic pin that was made obligatory for all persons over the age of 10. Not only wearing a badge, but residences were marked. This one says Jewish resident of Hebraistika, and this was absolutely obligatory. So the Jews were physically segregated, their property and assets were expropriated, and they were denied access to public places. They were forced to give up their valuables, starting with bicycles, automobiles, of course, radios, and typewriters. And they were subject also to ghettoization. I'd like to linger on that just a little bit, because it's not very widely known at all that ghettos were indeed instituted in Bulgaria, starting in the autumn of 1942 and continuing for 2 years until the Red Army entered Bulgaria in the autumn of 1944. This slide is the police decree for setting up the ghetto in the city of Plovdiv in central Bulgaria. I'll show you next the slide of the ghetto as it existed in the capital, Sofia. This is a map of downtown Sofia from about that era. The blue line, which I added to the map, shows the extent of the ghetto centered around the traditionally Jewish neighborhood of Yuchbunar. A little more magnified view of that in another map, a German map, the Yuchbunar area, which was the center of the ghetto. And Jews from other parts of the city, other parts of Sofia, were forced into this area, just as happened in ghettos throughout other parts of Nazi-aligned or Nazi-occupied Europe during the war. So all of this, indeed, happened in Bulgaria. And when focus on the Jews of Sofia, one more slide here. When the Jews of Sofia were expelled to the provinces, they suffered greatly. This is a photo of a family from Sofia that was expelled to the city of Haskovo in probably June of 1943. No place to stay. They wound up sleeping on the street for a while before some kind of accommodation was found. So all of this occurred in metropolitan Bulgaria, that is to say, Bulgaria proper. And all of it is very well documented by an abundant archival record, which was compiled by no less than the Bulgarian perpetrator agencies. It consists of contemporary paper records. This is not memory stuff. This is contemporary documents. Contemporary paper records, the internal working records of the Bulgarian perpetrator agencies, those who tormented, enslaved, robbed, and evicted the Jews. There are police records, there are administrative records, there are financial records, and there are military records. It's a paperwork generated by a pervasive bureaucratic complex of property confiscation, forced labor, and ghettoization. And these are the records which I have worked with as a historian at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And it was there that I began the study of the Holocaust in Bulgaria. Nobody else was doing anything with those records before I happened to come along and was surprised to find them there. It's applied historical research, and it's resulted in compensatory compensation payments, and pensions by the German finance ministry to living survivors. Too little and too late, in my opinion, but the point at least has been made for posterity. The German finance ministry, Bundesministerium der Finanzen, asked me for a series of historical briefs on each of some 37 individual ghettos in Bulgaria. I supplied them with the primary source documentation, and I summarized the contents for them. And they were very cooperative, actually. All of these places were recognized officially by the German side as meeting the criteria to define what a ghetto was. And so it's really co-equal status with those who suffered ghettoization in other parts of Europe. Now, I include these vignettes here to illustrate the point as a supplement to ELKA's film. And there was to summarize that portion, there was a Holocaust in metropolitan Bulgaria. But today being Yom HaShoah, I think we should spend just a little bit of time on those who actually perished in the Holocaust process. These people were brutally uprooted from the cities and towns of northern Greece, and we have a photograph here taken at the embarkation port of Lom in northwestern Bulgaria on the Danube. The people shown here were Greek Jews who had been rounded up, forced from their homes, and sent up to the river. They boarded barges, and from these barges, they were transported to Vienna, where they were then transshipped by rail to Treblinka. There were no survivors. Next slide shows the deportations from Macedonia. Notice that the railway car has the initials of the Bulgarian railways up there, and the guards are, of course, identifiable as in Bulgarian uniform. They're not being shoved onto the train by Germans, but by the Bulgarian army, this military uniform, not the. So from there, seeing these graphic illustrations of deportation, let's go on to a little focus on the city of Bitola in southwestern Bulgaria, southwestern Macedonia now. And I'll discuss a few finds I made while doing this research in North Macedonian archives. I'd seen on a website, on the website of the Macedonian archive, that they had some portions of scrolls, and they weren't quite sure what they were. They surmised that it might be scrolls from the Jewish community dating back to the actual scroll itself, dating back to sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries when the handwritten scroll was made. So when I got to the archive there, I asked them to take out the scroll. I didn't think they would actually show it to me, but they were very accommodating. The archivist there is a very accommodating guy, and he brought out the scroll for me, or what was left of it, and here it is. In fact, he asked me to hold down one corner of it while they started taking the pictures. So I'm not like an archive in America. Not with the white gloves and everything. No, it was very informal, and I'm holding down this scroll that was handwritten sometime about more than 500 years ago. Since I asked for it, they asked me to identify what the scroll was, and I have to say I never actually studied Hebrew, but they put me on the spot. So what do you do when they ask you to do that? Well, I took pictures of the scroll, or they gave me pictures of the scroll. I took them back to Washington and started studying them. I learned that there are certain calligraphic features on here which indicate that it's a Torah, which I suspected anyway. And from that, going from there, it was easy. You just select a few keywords and run it through an online version of the Torah, and bingo, found out it's part of the part of the Torah known as in Hebrew as Devarim, and which the world knows as Deuteronomy. But let's look at some faces of the people who actually heard these Torah sections chanted in services in the synagogues of Bitola during that period of time. I want you to look at these photos, which were taken by the premier photographer of Bitola at that time, a man of Vlach, Romanian origins, by the name of Milton Menaki, who was a remarkable photographer. He had a knack for really capturing the essence of various ethnic groups that he photographed, the life of the city. This one's taken earlier in the early part of the 20th century, as you can tell by the dress of these ladies. And they're posing sternly for the photograph. But what I really want you to look at here now more clearly are the faces of these guys in a musical group taken sometime in the late 1930s or early 1940s. It's really the faces that grab you, because when you look at these guys, they're dressed more or less the way we would dress nowadays. They seem to be pretty relaxed, and their faces are, well, because of the clarity of the photographs, they look like people you'd encounter on the street today. A little more close up here. And again, these people perished, probably all of them. Probably all of them were deported, or most of them were deported in March 1943. A few might have escaped to join the partisans, but that was no picnic either. To fight against the Bulgarian army in the partisans was a rather hazardous operation. Probably all these people perished during that period. But I'd like to conclude now with some street scenes of Bitola. Oh, here's one more family photograph by Milton Menaki. All of these people perished. I don't know the name of the family yet. It's one of my little projects to try to figure out who they were, because that's not among the captions offered at the archive in Bitola. But there are other photographs that do identify people, and it'll be a project of matching faces with names. So, walking the streets of Bitola, some streets and doorways. A street scene taken by Milton Menaki back in the 1930s or early 1940s. They're waiting for some parade or the other to come down the street, so people are lined up on the side of the street. And when I arrived in Bitola one Sunday afternoon in October of 2019, I decided I was going to look for traces of mezuzot, the traditional way that Jews voluntarily mark their own residences. This one is just a generic example of mezuzah. Notice the way it's traditionally displayed at a slight angle on a doorway or a doorpost. And I decided I was going to look into the doorways of Bitola streets nowadays, doorways on Bitola streets, and see if I could find where the mezuzot had been attached. And I thought it was a long shot, but as I walked down the street, these streets here, streets like this, I found, hey, yeah, look at that. A mezuzah was attached here. I took this photo. Another one here. And another one here. So the people are gone. the holes in the doorposts remain. That's how I'll conclude this presentation for Yom HaShoah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sage. I'm just thinking about, there's a young couple in Poland that actually also walks around different cities in the country trying to document mezuzahs that were previously there, and also the indentations. But we'll come back to the conversation about memory, historical memory and familial memory and personal memory in the discussion. I'd like to now introduce Dr. RUMYANA MARINOVA-CHRISTIDI, who's an associate professor of faculty of history at Sofia University, St. Kliment, Orthodox, and head of the Hebraistika BA program in Jewish Studies. She's a historian and teaches about the communist period in Bulgaria from World War II until 1989, education and ideology during communism, the Holocaust period, history of the Bulgarian Jews, history of the State of Israel, as well as diplomatic, ethnic, and cultural dimensions of the EU integration process in the Balkans. Dr. Christidi has been a visiting professor at the University of Haifa, Bar Ilan University, and Tel Aviv University, all in Israel, the University of Western Macedonia in Thessaloniki, Greece, the University Carlo Bo in Urbano, Italy, and at the Link Campus University in Rome. She is the author of two monographs and many articles in Bulgaria, as well as has written history textbooks about the communist period in the country. She's a member of the European Association for Jewish Studies, the Negev Association for Friends of Israel in Bulgaria, and on the Bulgarian delegation for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Dr. Christidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. I would like first to thank the Harriman Institute for this invitation. I'm happy and honored to be part of this panel. Thank you very much. I would like also to thank Dr. Steven Sage for recommending me, and also for the very interesting presentation. I will comment on it. And I would like to congratulate Mrs. ELKA NIKOLOVA for the lovely documentary she had created. I'm a historian, so I think I'm going to touch upon several issues here. First of all, I'm not going into details about the facts of the salvation. You can ask me if you like in the Q&A session later on, but I would like to point out the following. Was there a Holocaust in Bulgaria? The deportation, the labor camp, and the salvation. And in that order, the salvation will be the last point. And also, if I have some time at the end, I wanted to say a few things about anti-Semitism in Bulgaria and today as well. But very, very shortly, the question, was there a Holocaust in Bulgaria? Something that was also one of the main themes in ELKA's movie about the Bulgarian survivors. My answer as a historian is yes, there was a Holocaust in Bulgaria, not only because of the chronological boundaries that Yad Vashem had defined, the years 1939 and 45, but also the elements of the Holocaust, because the physical extermination is the, the final stage. And fortunately in Bulgaria, it didn't happen. But we have the other elements of the Holocaust, of course, the anti-Jewish legislation, deprivation of rights, limitations, restrictions, deprivation of property. Jews were removed from their positions, and also the administrative measures, the humiliation, the yellow stars, and so on and so on. So we've got all this in Bulgaria. And let's not forget that Jews lived in Bulgaria for more than 3 years in a country which is ally of Germany since March 1941, a country that had a written agreement for the deportation of the Jews, the Belef-Dannecker agreement, and a very, very full and heavy legislation, anti-Jewish legislation in the country, not just the law for the defense of the nation, but also the supplementary legislation. So we've got all this, but no one died as a Jew in the old borders of Bulgaria during the World War II. So it's obviously a European exception. And it's not something that happened, in a short period of time. It was something that went on for 3 years and more than 3 years. So the question about the Holocaust, if there was a Holocaust in Bulgaria, yes, with all its elements, but the final stage, the physical extermination. It didn't happen in Bulgaria. The deportation, another issue which is, of course, very important. The Bulgarian army entered the so-called new added territories in then Yugoslavia and Greece. It was Macedonia and Croatia, part of Greece and Yugoslavia at the time. Of course, Bulgaria had its historical explanations and reasons for these territories to consider its territories ethnically populated by Bulgarians and so on. But anyway, it was an occupation. So the Bulgarians occupied, the Bulgarian army occupied these territories. And yes, they were put under the control of the Bulgarian administration, incorporated into the territorial administrative organization of the Bulgarian kingdom. And Bulgarian administration, courts, police, and army moved in. But I would slightly disagree with Stephen here, with Dr. Sage, when he said that the Jews there were Bulgarian Jews. Now, technically, they were not. Even technically, they were not Bulgarian Jews, because when first the Germans, went to these territories, then the Bulgarian army and administration moved in, and the government and the Tsar, they issued a decree concerning citizenship in the liberated territories, according to which Greek and Yugoslavian citizens obtained automatically Bulgarian citizenship. However, according to Article 4 of this decree, the law didn't concern persons of Jewish origin. So the Jews in these territories, they were deprived of their Yugoslavian or Greek citizenship, but they didn't obtain Bulgarian citizenship. So they became apatrids, they became stateless. So even technically, they were not. It doesn't mean that the responsibility for their deportation doesn't lay on the Bulgarian authorities. On the contrary, actually, I just wanted to start this question with the deportation with, I have no doubts that it's the responsibility for the deportation and eventually the death of these people in Treblinka lays on the Bulgarian authorities. That's it, because the Jews were deported by the Bulgarian authorities. And it's another question if these people had a chance or not. My personal opinion is that nothing could be done for them. They would have been deported by the Germans anyway, but no one tried, not the local population, let alone the Bulgarian society. Not only because the Bulgarian society was kept in the dark about everything happening on the Jewish question, and there was no public scrutiny on the legislation and the acts of the government on the Jewish issue. They were not published. But even if people knew, they wouldn't view the Jews from these territories as their own Jews. No. And here we come to the salvation, but just a few words about the labor camps. I do agree here with Dr. Sage that, of course, the labor camps, they were not created for to save the Jews, and they were not picnic, of course. Life when you are forced, it's a forced labor, and it's a physical labor. And of course, it's suffering, but no one died there. No one died as a Jew. So I don't want to underestimate, the sufferings in the labor camp. On the contrary, And I clearly say that they were not created for the salvation of the Jews. But technically, people survived in these labor groups in Bulgaria. And it's completely different from being sent to the death camps outside Bulgaria. So, and now I come to the point of the salvation. First of all, I would like to say that there are three preconditions for the low level of anti-Semitism in Bulgaria, back then and today. And if I have time, I will prove with some surveys what I mean about today, what is the level of anti-Semitism. But it was in the Balkans, and especially in Bulgaria, the level of anti-Semitism was much lower than in the rest of Europe. Not because Bulgarians were especially good or especially philo-Semitic, no, but they were not anti-Semitic as well. And I would say three main reasons for that. First of all, religion doesn't play and didn't play a major role here in Bulgaria. People in Bulgaria, although Christians from the 9th century, they were never especially religious, observant, or for some reasons unknown to me, but people here never became religious. And the same is valid and applies to the minorities in Bulgaria. The Muslims here were never fanatically religious, and the Jews in Bulgaria were never, we didn't have Orthodox Jews here. We didn't have Jews looking like Jews here, you know, dressed in a specific attire, looking differently. And this is very important because people here could hate each other for many reasons. But believe me, religion is not one of these reasons. Just, it's not valid here. And also Bulgarian Jews were not rich. Of course, we have rich families and rich individuals, but as a whole, they were not, the percentage of rich people among them was very small. So this is also a precondition for not negative, not envy, not negative feelings towards them. So they live together with the Bulgarians, they live the same way, the same poor city population in Bulgaria, you know, like the rest of the people in the cities in Bulgaria at that time. So they work together with the rest of the population, they live together, not separately. They shared the same life. They were not obviously different or in any way different. And of course, also not only very well integrated in the society, but the Jews took a part very actively in all the wars that Bulgaria conducted for its unification, national unification. They fought together, they died together with the Bulgarians, and so they were, you know, fighting together. And the Bulgarians couldn't see the Jews as something alien to them, to something different, not because they especially loved them, but they didn't hate them. And so that's why the image of the negative image of the propaganda, the Nazi propaganda, couldn't find any ground in Bulgaria. Bulgarians couldn't associate the Jews neither with the Bolshevik evil and the agent of the Bolshevik evil, neither with the Jew, the capitalist, sucking blood for, you know, from the state and the ordinary Bulgarians. So it couldn't apply here. And so about the salvation, okay, you can ask those 48 or 49,000 people. Most of them are still alive and they are in Israel. And if you speak to them and say, it's not a salvation, it's a survival, they will say to you, no, we were saved by Bulgaria and by the Bulgarians. This is what they say. And they say, these are our lives, our 48, 49,000 lives. So don't tell me what happened. And if we survived or were saved or so they are grateful. They believe that Bulgarians save them. And of course, we have many, it's a complex thing. We have many factors here playing role. We have, of course, circumstances. We have the turn in the war, the general course of the war in 1943. We have, of course, the death of Tsar Boris, which actually contributed and helped the Jews, because the Germans didn't pressurize anymore on that issue after the death of the Tsar. We have, of course, the position of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which is actually the only church in Europe as an institution, not individual act, but as an institution that held this position from the beginning, even before joining Germany, from the beginning of the war. And in 1940, when the law for the defense of the nation, the draft, was created. So from the beginning until the end of the war, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church was doing things, acting, speaking openly in defense of the Jews. We have, of course, all these intellectuals, unions of the writers, of the doctors. We have Dimitar Peshev and his petition, and the members of the parliament. But I think that it was mainly we cannot say the whole people or the whole society. We've got everything in the society, including anti-Semitic people, but the majority of the Bulgarians, those ordinary, backward, if you like, not modern Balkan people, 80% rural population at the time, but with very strong patriarchal values. And the behavior of the most of the people for more than 3 years, and their position towards the Jews and their attitude, they gave alibi to the politicians and to the Tsar and the authorities not to proceed with the deportation. I'm sure that Tsar Boris would have deported the Jews if he had to, not because he was anti-Semitic, not at all, but he was an ally of Germany. And Bulgaria is the only ally of Germany that didn't fight in the war. The only ally that was not on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians. And on the top of it, we don't want to deport the Jews as well. So if there was more pressure from Germany, and if the circumstances were different, and if everything was kept in silent, probably Tsar Boris would have proceeded with the deportation, just to fulfill his obligations as an ally of Hitler. But when the information started spreading, when all those reactions in the society happened, in the parliament, in the church, in the ordinary, regular citizens, this is something that the Tsar didn't want to happen. He didn't want, this to be public, and to, he realized that it's better not to proceed with the deportation. But it was the majority of the Bulgarian population that gave alibi to the Tsar not to proceed. Or at least this is how I see things. And maybe I have some few more minutes to say a few words about anti-Semitism in Bulgaria today. Because very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a survey was conducted here in Bulgaria, ordered by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and some other ministries as well, about the level of anti-Semitism in the country. I just saw another survey and study conducted by Tel Aviv University, which is also very recent, about anti-Semitism in the world in 2021. And the Tel Aviv University survey reports a dramatic rise of anti-Semitism in the world after the COVID pandemic and in 2021, and also influenced by radical left and right-wing political movements and incitement on social media and so on. And Also, the report calls out the vast reach of social networks for spreading lies and incitement, and also conspiracy theories fueling anti-Jewish hate crimes, and they say also that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic manifestations return to the streets of Europe, and many more things. And we have the report for Bulgaria for the same year, 2021. And actually, there were two parallel surveys, one conducted by in the Bulgarian society, the Bulgarians, and another one, a parallel survey in the Jewish community of Bulgaria. So we could compare how the community view things and how the Bulgarians or the rest view anti-Semitism. So very briefly, just the main conclusions from this survey. The hate speech in Bulgaria is a problem for 70% of the representatives of the Jewish community, and for 30% in the Bulgarian society as a whole. But about relations between Bulgarians and Jews in the country, the whole conclusion is that inter-ethnic relations in Bulgaria, and especially between Jews and Bulgarians, are especially good, and with the exception of the relations with the Roma community. So inter-ethnic relations in Bulgaria are good, only with the Roma community, it's another issue. Especially the Jews feel especially well here in Bulgaria, and the Bulgarians vice versa feel very positive towards the Jews. And 83% of the Bulgarians say they have very positive attitude to the Jews. 60% of the Bulgarians say that they feel completely fine with Jews occupying high positions in the country. 52% of the Bulgarians say that they don't mind if a member of the family marries a Jewish person. And they say that the rest, the other percentage is not because they have something against the Jews, but just because for cultural reasons. And not to take more time, but I want to say how much of the Jews, how they feel in Bulgaria. 80% of the Jews feel completely secure in their everyday life. And they say that hate speech they encounter is mainly in internet and social media. And only 11% of the Jews in Bulgaria say that there is a rise of anti-Semitism in the country. And 17% of them have witnessed themselves some anti-Semitic activities, mainly in the internet and the social media, and some inscriptions on buildings, some swastikas or things like that. So I think my time is over. Maybe if you have questions and answers, I'll try to give some answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I've been sitting here just like writing notes, and again, in reviewing the movie and the articles that each of you have produced, it's what I'm really struck with right now, especially, is given the interest by so many historians around the world in Holocaust memory, that in some ways it feels like one of the tensions that comes up in each of your presentations is somehow there's a suppression of the memory of the Holocaust in Bulgaria. Each of you have opened up with there was a Holocaust that took place there. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the tension between oral history, collective memory, and factual history. And I say that because Dr. Sage, you've spoken a lot about, and actually Dr. CHRISTIDI, about the role of communism in suppressing the memory, and then also the migration of Jewish people post-war, a large number of them, a significant number, to Israel. So I was wondering if we could have a conversation about that. And ELKA, if you could also talk about how this influenced the work you did and the stories that you heard from the survivors that were interviewed in your film.
Could I lead off on that?
Please.
Okay, the story of a rescue, I would date back to the communist period, but not at the very beginning of the communist period. One major point I'd like to interject here is the fact that the very first Holocaust trial, the very first judicial proceeding in the world, anywhere, to focus on the Holocaust per se, was in Bulgaria. It was the trial of 64 Bulgarian perpetrators, accused perpetrators, held in Sofia from March the 7th of 1945 to April the 2nd of 1945. This was a People's Court session number 7. And it had been in preparation since the autumn of 1944, when the big change in government happened and Bulgaria switched from the Axis to the Allied side. So what was the result of this trial? It went on for some 3 weeks, but before the trial itself, there were pre-trial depositions filed with the court, numbering literally the hundreds of depositions. The whole trial proceeding takes up some 10 reels of microfilm, which I used for years at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And it's a very extensive record of what did happen within Bulgaria itself, and also, of course, the deportations from the occupied areas. One remarkable thing that stands out from this trial is that throughout the entire proceedings, reading all the depositions and all the testimony, there isn't a single mention of a rescue. There's no time marker there. Nobody talks about a rescue. It's only later, starting around 1948, 49 or so, that people start mentioning a rescue in Bulgaria. And it's at that very same time, 1948, 49, that about 90% of the Jews left Bulgaria to go to Israel. A point I'd like to make here is that they left a country at peace to go to a country that was involved in a shooting war, was surrounded by enemies who were intent on doing what? On annihilating the Jews, driving them into the sea and wiping them out, and finishing Hitler's work. So the point is this, that you don't have a rescue mentioned anywhere in this trial record, and the trial record really is the first draft of the history of the Holocaust in Bulgaria. After that, the story of a rescue continues throughout the communist period, propagated very largely by these minority of Jews who remained in Bulgaria. They were good communists, and they did their work as communists, coming up with factors, distorting history, forgetting all about the deportations from Macedonia and Greece, and talking up the idea that Bulgaria was in some way a kind of Balkan Denmark. Now, once you've promulgated a story and inculcated a population with it through film, through books and educational materials, it takes on a life of its own. And the rescue story really perpetuated itself from then. But going back again to the trial, People's Court number 7, session 7, 1945, while the war was still going on, they're conducting this trial. There's no rescue in that trial record. That's what I have to say.
Dr. Christidi?
Yes, thank you. Well, that's true. And Dr. Sage was the first one, to write an article and to speak years ago about this court in Bulgaria, part of the People's Court that took place from January to the end of March 1945. And yes, one of these courts was the first Holocaust, a court that entirely against, crimes against the Jews. And yes, no one at that time mentioned rescue, but at that time, no one mentioned Holocaust at all. And not only in 45, many years later, nobody spoke about the Holocaust, let alone those who survived, So it took time, and we see this also in ELKA's documentary. People didn't realize exactly what happened. It took years and they perceive it in a different way. So they couldn't realize the scale of danger at that time, what they really escaped, how it happened, because it was still going on. And it was, nobody spoke about rescue, Holocaust, or camps or things like that. And but there was, you call it rescue, salvation, survival, whatever you call it. These people, as I mentioned, well, we have the same population in the old borders of the Bulgaria before the war and after the war, Jewish population. No one died as a Jew, whatever the reasons. We can speak about the reasons and, to discuss a lot about that. But this is the fact. And the whole community, of course, the deportation of the Jews from the new added territories, as I mentioned, it's responsibility of the Bulgarian authorities at that time. It's clear. But those few words about the communist times, the whole community in the old borders, and they remained the same borders after the wars, the whole community was intact physically. And when the Fatherland Front took over the government, the communists basically, the Bulgarian Jews consider this their liberation. I mean, they greeted the new regime and the new government because it was anti-Nazi, anti-fascist regime, coming there. So it was the end of the threat for the Jews. They didn't feel under threat anymore. But this is the community. They say this, not me. And why they emigrated to Israel? First of all, because they were allowed to do so. Not so many countries did so. The Soviets, they didn't allow their Jews to emigrate to the newly established state of Israel. But Bulgaria allowed the Jews to live. And actually, they lived en masse when the state of Israel was established. And yes, they, as soon as they arrived there, they started fighting for the new state of Israel. But I have asked them many times, why did you leave the country that you say it's your, they say we have motherland and fatherland, or I don't know how to put it in English. They say, that Bulgaria is our motherland, Israel is our homeland and motherland, or, it's for them, it's the love and gratitude for Bulgaria and of course their state of Israel. And they said, we left because in Bulgaria, not because, but it was the country that saved their lives, one way or another. But because in 1948, Bulgaria already became a communist state in the sense of, it was Soviet type of communism, not at the first years, the early 40s, but from the end of 1947-48, Bulgaria became Soviet type of communist regime. So, and of course, there you have nationalization of the property, not to the Jews, for all the people in Bulgaria, the nationalization of industry. And of course, it was not for the Jews. And of course, the newly established state of Israel was naturally attractive center for all the Jews from all over the world. So they left en masse. 90% of the community left. And Stephen, you're right that the hard communists remained here. And they were part of the regime. They occupy high positions during the communist regime in Bulgaria, because the regime in Bulgaria was not anti-Semitic, the communist regime. You know, it followed the anti-Semitic waves in the Soviet Union with some measures here in Bulgaria, but it was never really anti-Semitic. Nevertheless, Jews were allowed here during communism to occupy high positions, but never the highest. For example, we never had a Jew member of the Politburo. We have very good advisor to Todor Zhivkov, the communist leader, one of his, you know, very close and for a long period of time, closest advisor, who was a Jew, but not a member of the Politburo, for example. And general in the army, I think in the late 80s, we had the first Jew who reached the rank of general in the army. So high positions, but not the highest. And always some ambivalent attitude, you know, towards the Jews during communism. Okay, they are part of the regime, part of us, comrades, but they are Jews. So not to occupy the discussion, but if you have other questions.
Elka, please.
Yes, I just wanted to show you a book that I found. It's from 1977, and this is actually a very interesting. It was issued by it's an official party sort of book document, which focuses on the participation of the Jewish members of the partisan. A lot of Jews became partisans during the wartime. Some of them escaped from labor camps and joined the partisans. So that was very, that was the line that was in Bulgaria, because as Dr. Christidi mentioned, the Jews who remained in Bulgaria were communists. So this was the line that was dominant, that, you know, the participation. But the members of, like, the participants in my film were, as I said, they were from middle-class families, they were from well-to-do families, and they lost basically everything before they left. So for them, and as Misha said in the film, for us, the kind of communism, the kind of society that this was becoming was not acceptable. So we are going to look for something else. And also they came from families who were not only wealthy, but entrepreneurial, meaning that they wanted to keep going and keep developing and keep expanding and keep. So when they arrived in Palestine, because Robert and Chaim first arrived in Palestine before they went there in 1944, Robert's family, because they had relatives in New York, they just basically came here right away, maybe in a year or so, because they wanted to, they didn't, Israel, and once Israel was created, it was still in a very vulnerable state. So they really couldn't, they sort of like escaped from one place to, they just felt that they wanted to try something new. And I think that that's how the Jews, the Bulgarian Jews who ended up in New York or in the United States were from these kinds of families who were wealthy or had businesses, and they just wanted to continue, you know, try this in a new place. And so for them, they didn't, even though they all had a very good connection to Bulgaria, they had a lot of Bulgarian friends, but once they went from kind of like in the route in a roundabout way to arrive in America, they had a very, very, very little contacts with Bulgaria, because Bulgaria was a very closed country. And also, as I said, the people who remained in Bulgaria, the Jews who remained in Bulgaria, were mostly communists. And then for years, that story dominated the narrative of the Bulgarian, what happened to the Bulgarian Jews. And I think that's where the rescue came from. And I think part of the debate today is sort of like between this different kind of points of views of what happened to the Jews, who saved the Jews, or that is still a live debate. And I guess Dr. Christidi will can talk about that. But yeah, so I think that after the changes, they were very excited to go back and reconnect with the current country. They visited a number of times. They retrieved some of their property. which they solved, but it was something that they kept the connection. They had a very good memory before the war of a life that was very good, that was taken away from them, but nonetheless they had that part of their memory of their life in Bulgaria when they were together as a family, when they had a good standing in society. That was the good part of their sort of connection to the country. So and that's why I think that they had a good memory of that part. And of course, the rest is which they struggle with, like how is it possible to for this to happen? So yeah.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to weave in sort of two themes that have come up in the questions. The first is with respect to documentation. And there's been a long conversation today about what the authorities did versus how Bulgarian citizens felt about their Jewish neighbors. So one question is, were civilians involved in helping the authorities to expropriate property and to discriminate against Jewish people? And I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is the role of bystanders and upstanders, if you will. And then as Jewish people are returning from coming out of the Holocaust, can we talk just a little bit about when the government decided, or did they decide to return Jewish property that had been plundered?
Could I lead off with that?
Please.
Okay. Property confiscations. These affected different areas, geographic areas, somewhat differently. Of course, for the Jews of the areas that were occupied, Macedonia, the city of Pirot in Serbia, and the towns of northern Greece, everybody was deported. And the authorities then went through their homes and synagogues and took everything. There was some differentiation between ordinary household goods and what we might call cultural properties, that is to say, musical instruments, books, paintings, and of course, religious artifacts, also antiques, traditional handicrafts. The ordinary stuff, the mundane furniture and what have you, furnishings of ordinary homes were put up for auction. And here was a wonderful opportunity for getting goods on the cheap. And Macedonian people and others, Muslims and gypsies and what have you, Roma people living in Macedonia, attended these auctions and bought up the stuff. Tracing the cultural properties, on the other hand, is a little more difficult. I found some of them in museums in Macedonia, and some others simply disappeared into private collections. There was an awful lot of pilferage by the officials who took the stuff to begin with, and by the ordinary people who were supposed to safeguard the expropriated goods when they were warehoused, some in the synagogues and some in tobacco warehouses and what have you. The situation in Sofia is a bit like that in Macedonia, in that household goods were also expropriated, but in Sofia, the synagogues remained under Jewish control and were not plundered. And then there's the situation in the other towns of metropolitan Bulgaria, where you don't have the plundering of household goods the way you do in Sofia or in the occupied territories. As for bank accounts, now that's another story entirely. In Macedonia, they were all taken over, all the banks were taken over by the Bulgarian National Bank, Narodna Banka, and the bank had force majeure. Tracing what happened to the accounts after they were taken over is a bit of a problem. There are also other problems regarding sequestered and confiscated bank accounts within metropolitan Bulgaria. And since that's an ongoing issue, it's best not to commit myself too much on that score right now. Bank accounts, cultural properties, and ordinary household goods. The question was then, did ordinary people participate? Yes, there were auctions and they were widely attended, and the goods were sold. And of course, most of the goods are no longer traceable. Occasionally, you do find some things that turn up that are identifiably belonging to one or another owner or to Jews in general, but that's the rarity. Okay.
May I say a few words also about, because I see also questions about the property. Dr. Sage spoke about the new added territories, Macedonia and Greece. It's much more complicated there because these territories, they didn't even stay in Bulgaria anymore. I mean, Bulgarians left in 1944. So it was another regime of dealing with the property. But the property of the Jews in the other borders of the kingdom that remained actually the same after the peace treaty and after the war. Well, the communist government restored immediately all the rights of the Jewish population, liquidated everything, you know, from the anti-Jewish legislation, and they started the process of, you know, restoring everything when the Aliyah process started, and actually the Jews left. And how, because I see also question what happened after the fall of communism, after 1989. So many Jews, they sold their apartments, their property before they left for Israel. And some of them didn't. And during communism, there were several lawyers that were approved by the Communist Party to deal with the Jewish property. So only these several lawyers could deal with this, because actually the Jews, they could do things with their property, although we broke relations with Israel in 1967. But there were many restrictions to have the money only in Bulgarian bank and only in Bulgarian currency and so on and so on. After the fall of communism, after 1989, and actually in the 90s, I can tell you about the communal property, the property of the community. It was given back to the community by the state, by the municipality. I mean that the Jewish community managed to get all their property that belonged to the community, and there are very famous buildings in the center of Sofia, and they belong to the Jewish community today. What concerns private property, it depends. I know people who came back to Bulgaria from Israel, and they managed to get their property, and some other that couldn't manage to do this. It's a matter of money and lawyers, and it's very individual, you know, for the private property. But the communal property, the property of the community, is back to the community, it belongs to them.
Yeah, I also wanted to say something. I know for sure that Robert Bakish was able to, after 89, they were able to go to Bulgaria. He found the site of his father's factory, and that the building, he said the building was still there, and they were able to sell that. And also they had a beautiful house on Gurko number 5. That's a beautiful building. I actually finished the film with that. That building, they also were able to get back, and they sold all their, were able to sell their property, which was returned after 89. I know that Chaim Zemak, he passed away recently in January, and I went to look into his papers, and I saw a correspondence that he had with lawyers in Bulgaria, that he was trying to sell his property as well. So I guess he also managed to do that, because there were a number of people who inherit that. Misha, I know that he said that his family was not able to do that, because I don't know what happened and why they were not able to do it, but because his parents just refused to go back. They didn't want to they just really didn't want to go back and deal with that. So, but I also from doing my research for the next documentary, which has to do with the Greek the town of Drama, which is part of northern Greece, I looked at a lot of the documents, and that was the case when they confiscated each house's items. They were described and item by item, which belongs to which family, and then they had public auctions when and because the woman in my film was a dressmaker and she had this sewing machine, and all women had sewing machines at the time, they had collected all the sewing machines, and they would have auction of sewing machines, or they will have auctions of beds, or auctions of the same type of items where people can come or the Red Cross can come and buy 20 beds because they need it or the sewing machine to sew. So that's how the property was actually kind of dispersed. And because nobody came back, they just really, at some point it was transferred, I guess, to the community in Athens once everything was over. But yes, the property was sort of dispersed, and there are a few items that still remain, mostly, I guess, at the museum.
I want to thank each of you. We could certainly continue this dialogue for much longer, but we actually have to end. So I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Christidi, thank you to Dr. Sage, thank you to Ms. Nikolova. And I also wanted to make sure, for those of you that haven't seen her film, the link to register to watch it is still available on Columbia University's Harriman Institute website. And coming up at noon, the second part of the virtual symposium will continue with the discussion about the fates of Roma and Sinti people during the Holocaust in the former Yugoslavia, which marks the launch of new research that's been conducted there by the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, along with the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. On behalf of the Harriman Institute and the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College, thank you all so much for participating today, and we hope you stay safe and well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr.
very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I stay to answer a few questions here. And Елка, също можем да останем, ако искате, няколко минутки. But first I would like to say, Stephen, I'm so happy to see you. I will be in New York in June, in Washington, actually. I land in Washington on the 11th of June. And